I want to get to the audience Q&A, so please hold those thoughts. But first, I'd like to give Nate and Peter a chance to respond to each other's comments in general. 25 words or less.
25 words.
2,500 words or less.
2,500 words. Well, we're really on the same tribe. I didn't talk about externalities, and those are, what we're doing to the biosphere and other species and everything is something that we need to know and care about, because it's ominous. I would say that at the confluence of our two talks is the concept of the choice of degrowth or responding to the end of growth. In my opinion, I think the odds are incredibly low that we will educate the policymakers and our constituents of our countries, the world, that we will choose that more benign path. I think it's much more likely that the end of growth will happen naturally, as it's doing right now, and that there will be some sort of crises or series of crises or mini crises, and then the ideas that are laying around, like this one, hopefully are adopted. So I think there's a difference between choosing the end of growth and the end of growth physically happening. The time to choose it was 30 or 40 years ago.
Okay, I'll make a comment, then I'm going to ask Nate a question. I'm also very concerned that the time available to us to make a relatively smooth transition of our own choosing is getting very short. But it's really difficult to know just how much time we have. I've been involved in the environmental movement for a long time, since the 1960s, and people have been sounding warning bells sort of a decade ahead for a long time. We've got 10 more years, we've got 10 more years. Well, we're now at 2015. So I'm a little bit less secure in thinking about how much time we have. And I do think it's worth, and I take your point, Nate. I think what I'm trying to do with my work very much is as circumstances arise and people say, well, what are our other options? At least there's something we can put before them. But I did mention that I thought that new measures of success, new measures of prosperity were really important. The newscasts are always telling us, about GDP, what it's doing, because we don't feed them anything else. We really need, and I hope that maybe this institution can help in the development of alternative measures of prosperity. And then I think we might get a movement away from this continual significance given to growth. The question I wanted to put to you was, to what extent do you think the current financial system is capable of accommodating, if you want to call it degrowth, or some alternative economic future along those lines? Or are we facing the problem we have to completely overhaul the financial system?
I will answer that and then respond to something else you said previously. I think there's very little chance of the financial system having the ability to do the things that you talked about. First of all, a carbon price means that we boost the wages higher on our fossil co-workers, right? If we add a tax on coal, oil, or natural gas, we're therefore reducing the benefits from the work that they give us, which we should do, yes, but it means more poverty, everything else being equal. I think the financial system is doing everything in its power just to optimize dollars in the short term, when we really ought to be optimizing a multivariable issue. Now, my other comment was, I fully agree we need to do something other than just optimizing GDP, but it's something that's a little correlated with how we evolved, right? It's the optimal foraging theory that energy correlates with health, but it's kind of gone haywire. I used to make $500,000 a year on Wall Street. I spent it all in some orgy of consumption, kind of like the Wolf of Wall Street, and now I have very little savings left. I make $45,000 a year doing this sort of consulting. I've never been happier in my life because I get paid in things other than money. Mm-hmm. I get paid, I spend more time with my dogs. I'm out in nature a lot. I educate young people. I'm getting paid in social capital, natural capital, instead of focused on financial capital. And I did that because I had the opportunity to do it. So my point is that society, there's a chance that we can relearn what's really important to us, but I doubt that we'll do it ahead of time. So the more people that are kind of on that chessboard, staying in the game, that kind of have figured all this out, we need leaders to get that going.
Rebuttal?
Well, I'm surprised you comment on the carbon price. There are many examples now where jurisdictions have put in place a carbon price. British Columbia, for example, has a carbon tax. And it introduced this tax to discourage people in British Columbia from consuming fossil fuels so heavily, and at the same time reduced other taxes. In fact, it was written into the law that this carbon tax should not generate any net revenue for the government. And the party that introduced this carbon tax was re-elected. And now, funnily enough, the people in British Columbia are taking some pride in the fact that they are seen as, if not world leaders, but leaders in North America in this particular policy. And in Ontario, we just heard an announcement that the government's going to initiate a cap and trade program. Quebec already has one, which generates a price on carbon. I think that there's quite a bright future for that policy instrument. The one other thing I would say, though, is yes, it will have and does have different kind of impacts on people according to their income level and so on, their consumption pattern. I take the view that you can't expect an improvement in the way we deal with fossil fuels to also solve the poverty problem. That's why I think it's so important to have good anti-poverty programs to deal with poverty alongside programs that deal with the environment. There's a kind of a more complete approach to policy. I think I'd like to hear from the audience.
Well, can I reply to that?
Yeah, just,
I don't think so.
Can I reply to that?
one quick thing, and then we'll go to questions. Okay?
So,
Quick. If you can.
yeah, well, first of all, getting back to your graph about the material throughput and the non-material throughput, it's the same thing in British Columbia. They're still buying things that are made with carbon somewhere in the world that aren't carbon taxed. I mean, there's carbon went into this, carbon went into this, carbon went into everything because China is using very low cost coal to produce things. The second point is, and this is where Peter and I will disagree probably pretty strongly, is we've both read Spirit Level and about how more equitable societies are more healthy. I think solving poverty is a natural thing in groups of people to say we need more wealth equality because people like to hear that. I think it's largely incommensurate with solving climate change and some of our other problems because the driver of our problem right now is higher, the driver of our economic problem is higher resource extraction costs. The bottom 40% of Americans spend 100% of what they make. The top 5% spend 7% of what we make. If we were to have a wealth transfer, then all that digital money that's just sitting in the ether right now gets directed towards resource consumption, higher oil and things like that. So it's a virtuous cycle. The other thing we talk about equality is how are we talking about Americans or Americans, Canadians, or all humans alive today, or all humans that might ever live, or including other species. So I think the poverty versus environmental things, there's a real disconnect there. And I personally don't think they can all be solved, not in conventional ways. Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you. Okay, great. You, sir. Yes. Yes.
Thank you guys very much. I'm Gery Barney. I'm with a nonprofit here called Our Task. And I am a physicist. And I took economics. And when I took economics, I put up my hand and I said, Professor, this is a perpetual motion machine. And I very nearly failed that course just because I raised that issue. But I wasn't satisfied, so I went on and I eventually founded another nonprofit called Millennium Institute. And I went and got the World Bank's model that they use on every country, called the Revised Minimum Standard Model Extended. And I built a system dynamics model around that. And when it came to the production function, I added that part of what goes into production is energy and resources, and that no production function works without producing waste. And so I got it connected to the environment, I got it connected to resources. And I was able to apply that model actually in planning in 20 different countries before I retired, and that work is continuing on. Now what I'm doing is helping young people from all over the world come together and produce a study like the Global 2000 study that I directed for President Carter. And we're trying to take these kinds of issues that you're talking about and get that built into a report that is not going to be addressed to a president. It's going to be addressed to the parents and grandparents of the young people. And I hope that maybe some of the talks and papers and slides that you guys used, we might be able to get access to, and that could help us inform that process. Thank you.
Of course, a good bit of what they've said is in the book. So
I'll
please buy the book.
Respond to that real quickly. So I've been working on this issue since I left Wall Street 15 years ago, and I've come to the conclusion that it's the young people where things are going to change. So I'm writing a book now, a user's guide to the 21st century, entropy and empathy, directed towards 16 to 24-year-olds. Because at that age, they're smart enough to understand each component of what we face, but they don't have mortgage payments or a car or a baby, and so that the cognitive dissonance doesn't pull them in a different direction. So I absolutely think that young people are aware of what's happening. They don't know all the details, but they know that their future is going to be different than their parents, and they obviously really care about the biosphere and the ocean and things that they should care about. So I think that's great, working with young people, yeah.
And I endorse that, of course.
Lincoln.
My name is Lincoln Day. I'm a retired sociologist and demographer. It's always worth coming to these meetings. I'm always very impressed with them, and it's time well spent. But I would like to, and also I might say in this particular instance, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
No, okay. I would say in this particular instance, it's a particular pleasure to see not just one but two economists who recognize the existence of limits. For a long time, I thought Herman Daly was about the only one who did. And the emphasis on human behavior. But I would like to mention that there are two things that I think could have been addressed that haven't been mentioned so far. And one of them is war and preparations for war. The drain on the natural environment, the drain on human beings, and the drain on the economic systems represented by war and preparations for war. Just as an example, half of the discretional budget of the United States under both the Obama administration and the previous administrations, we won't mention them by name, half of it goes for war, fully half of it. And that means other things have to be drained. But something else that I would like to have seen approached a little bit more is the car. Back in the days that was about 45 years ago, when I was living in Connecticut for purposes of illustration in a class I was teaching, I tried to estimate what proportion of the land area of the state of Connecticut was devoted to cars. I came up with 5%. Now that was just the roads. That didn't include the verges, didn't include the parking areas. It was just what was in roads. My guess is probably about half of the police budget in the state of Connecticut at the time was spent on cars as well, the feeding and care of cars. But at any rate, I think that it would be, this is a behavioral thing. I see no reason why we should support cars to the extent that we do, and certainly not given what they do as far as the environment is concerned. This little estimate of mine, as I say, about 5%, said nothing about the verges, nothing about driveways, and nothing about parking areas. A recent study found that for every automobile in the United States, there are 8 parking areas. Those are paved areas, areas moved away from agriculture, recreation, anything else. This is a behavioral matter, and I think we could do a lot just to get rid of it. And just one last thing, as a sociologist living in Washington now for 21 years in retirement, without a car, I do a lot of walking. As a demographer, I do a lot of counting. And I find that virtually never do I get more than one out of 5 cars with more at any time. Virtually never do you get more than 1 out of 5 cars, and usually no more than 1 out of 10 cars with one person in them besides the driver.
Thank you, Lincoln. Those are telling points. Did you want to respond?
Well, I just had a 5-word answer to that and hand it over to Peter. War is good for GDP. And so we need to move away from GDP, certainly.
Look, you're quite right. There were so many things that we didn't mention. This is a lot more complicated than we were able to convey in our was it 20 minutes each? But I just want to say that I accept your points, but I did try to emphasize that investment is what links the present to the future. So funds that are going into the war machine can be diverted to alternative kinds of infrastructure, which doesn't have to support the car. We can have, so I mean, what I'm trying to say is implicit in what I was presenting before was very much a perspective that's very similar to yours, that we've got choices that can be made that are a lot better than the ones that are being made now. And I still want to come back to the point that I think if we had a better measure of success that was widely accepted, we might very well see the politicians gravitating toward these alternative steps and away from the things that just happen to increase GDP.
Yes, ma'am. Back there, by the door. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name is Rosanna Marie.
Can you stand up, please? Thanks.
Oh.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Rosanna Marie Neal, and I'm with the Sustainable World Initiative. Thank you so much for your talk. It was very informative. I like that you mentioned environmental accounts because that is a tool that we strongly advocate for. I think that we're at a time when every country needs to be accounting for both the supply and demand of natural resources. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is calculating a demand-supply ratio for every nation as a measure of progress. Is that something that you currently do? Do you calculate and track the demand-supply ratio for different countries, both at the domestic level and in terms of international trade? And how useful do you think that would be as a measure of progress?
I didn't exactly hear what it was you were proposing to measure. The demand and supply for what?
Natural resources.
For natural resources. Well, the only, the short answer to your question is no, I don't do a lot of work on that particular aspect beyond when I look at the Canadian economy and I look at different possible paths for it into the future. I calculate what that would mean for our resource industry because we're a resource-based economy, and some of the scenarios can be light in their demands for resources and others are much heavier. But I haven't got involved in the kind of global analysis that you're talking about, which would be very well worth doing, but I haven't done it.
I'll reply briefly to that. Last week, I had co-organized a conference at Stanford with an intent of getting funding and interest in measuring our energy and natural resources in energy and natural resource terms, not in dollar terms. And there were a lot of kind of mid-level analysts there that were very supportive and presented their research. But the more senior people, the economists, were like, well, why do we need to do that? We measured in money. We don't need, I mean, they were totally didn't get that, and they projected the growth trends into the future. So absolutely, we need an honest accounting of our natural resource source and sink balance sheets in order to figure out what's possible, I think.
We're about to lose Peter, so I want to take 1 or 2 more questions, and I think we'll move to the reception. Sir, all the way in the back, man in the beard.
The name is Victor Timobing. I'm a retired chemical engineer, and I work for a non-for-profit organization called the Safe Water Team, trying to provide some very basic filtration devices for producing clean water. It's really a question, but a comment primarily. I think for me, one of the most illuminating articles that I've read in the State of the World, various issues, was an article, a chapter that was written by your colleague, Tim Jackson, called The Challenge of Sustainable Lifestyles. And I think most of you who read that will remember. And it follows along the comments that the gentleman made here. I mean, he asked a very basic question. What would happen if everybody in this world lived like the average American? Well, and of course, I mean, you can see the responses here. That's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, it cannot happen. The world, the earth cannot support that kind of a lifestyle. And the options, the solutions that he offered were three: population control, that we can dream of some significant technological innovations that would do miracles for us, or we change our lifestyles. And I remember having a discussion with some of my colleagues. At the time I was working for a very large chemical company. And one response that I got back was, I do not want any government telling me how to live. That was the response that I got back. But I mean, I want to ask you two gentlemen, I think some of the things that you're talking about here address this issue of how do we respond as the human species? How do we respond to these challenges? And the more I think about it, the more I come to the proposal that Tim Jackson offered, that we need to change our lifestyles. I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, if Tim said it, it must be true. Well, I think I mean, I of course agree with what he's saying, but you know, you have to then go beyond that. The kind of reaction your friend gave you is not uncommon. You can sort of agree that we need to change the way we live, but resent being told by somebody else how you're going to do that. And that's why I put in one of my slides governance, which was supposed to include the sort of the full range of decision-making, democratic decision-making, and so on. So the challenge to us is to make use of the opportunities we have to have this discussion sort of collectively about how we should live differently, so that it's not forced upon us so much as decided by ourselves for us. But it's not entirely clear that we have all the institutions we need in place to have that discussion, which is a particularly troubling aspect. So I'm on side with the idea very much that we can live more, we can live better, we can enjoy life more if we live differently. It's not as if the way that you live here and the way we live in Canada is somehow the pinnacle of human achievement. There's lots wrong with it, and lots of opportunities for improvement. And so I'm quite optimistic about that. I'm just not as optimistic as I'd like to be about our capacity to have the discussion in a proactive way that's going to lead where we want to get to.
Real quickly, I think education is important, but not sufficient. We're not going to change people's minds with more facts, and so that's why I think with young people, if we attempt to change their self-identity with leadership roles about what's possible, and kind of a pithy short phrase is kind of collapse first and beat the rush, where you kind of make yourself more resilient, because it's not, I don't think it's going to come from top down. I think there's going to be enclaves of people and examples that lead and do things a little differently. It's going to happen slowly, probably too slowly. But to make yourself kind of think about how could I live differently, and if you can't think about that, if you can't do that, then that tells you the magnitude of the problem. But I am certain that we can live with less, a lot less. I just don't think it's going to happen from a let's vote for that sort of scenario.
I think we're going to have to cut it off here, folks. Peter needs to leave to catch a plane, but I would urge you and invite you warmly to join us for the reception, if you can stick around for a bit. And I know that the authors would be happy to discuss some of those questions that you had personally. So why don't we just take a break and do that? And we'll see you next year. Thank you.
Very nice to see you.